Welcome in to Locked On Knicks. The Knicks have a pretty big hole at the backup center right now, but they've got some options to fill it in thanks to how things shook down with the Mikal Bridges trade. So, how do they go ahead and plug that hole? I'll figure it out next on Locked On Knicks.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
All right, welcome in to Locked On Knicks. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Knicks first listen today and every day, whether you're checking us out on your favorite podcast platform or taking insights and sounds on YouTube. We appreciate you making us part of your daily routine. Make sure you hit that auto download function on your favorite podcast app or the notification bell on YouTube so you never miss an episode. I'm Alex Wolf. I'm editor-in-chief of Knicks site The Strickland, which you can find at thestrick.land. And today, I'm going over some center options. So I know Gavin went into this a little bit last week. I wanted to kind of get my 2 cents in, which, by the way, shout out to Gavin for holding it down last week. I went and hiked the Grand Canyon last week. It was tough. Not on the top of things that I think I want to do again, but I did do it and I made it all the way through. And I'm still alive here to tell the tale of Precious Achiuwa, who's the first name that I'm going to get into in this episode. So as far as backup center options, I mean, why not look in-house, right? Like Precious Achiuwa did so well for the Knicks, especially in the regular season when they needed someone to fill in, when both Mitchell Robinson and Isaiah Hartenstein were hurt, or even just when just one of them was hurt. He stepped right in. And I mean, things were ugly at first when he first came over from Toronto. And I remember thinking like, oh, geez, I don't know if this guy's going to work out. And then suddenly, just like Tibbs always does, he took him, he put him into a role that made sense for him. You know, he said, hey, you have to do like 3 things. We just want you to rebound the ball, on both ends of the floor. We want you to just be big and be vertical around the rim, deter guys from scoring around the rim. And, we want you to, in his case, I think we saw a little more of like get out and run in transition and, just get out there and be ready to, sprint down the court and potentially get a layup or a dunk or whatever. And he did pretty well with that. So, the Knicks have restricted free agent rights, and they can sign Precious Achiuwa freely to come back as long as they stay under the hard cap of $188.9 million. As I noted in the previous episode, the Knicks now find themselves with $16.9 million of wiggle room to fill like 3 roster spots, which is good. That's really good problems to have. It stinks to be hard capped or whatever, but I think that gives them more than enough wiggle room to fill those final spots and hopefully, get themselves positioned well for the season with good depth across the board, including at the center spot, which I think is, as of right now, ironically, even though it was their biggest strength, I think going into this offseason, now it's sort of their biggest weakness. So they have to figure that out. I think with these last couple of signings, or if they make a trade, which I'll get into in a second as an option. But in this case, I think Precious Achiuwa is a great option for the Knicks. So they have restricted free agent rights once again, which I mentioned. And that basically means that if any other team attempts to sign Precious Achiuwa, as long as it's not for $17 million as a starting salary, which I don't think it will be, or else he would have been signed by now, then the Knicks have the ability to match that salary and say, okay, yeah, Team X, you want to sign him for 3 years for $21 million or whatever, we'll just sign our name on that deal instead. And we're going to keep Precious Achiuwa. If I had to guess as to why a deal hasn't been done to keep Precious in New York yet, it's probably because he and his representation are going around trying to find that magical offer. And the Knicks are probably just sitting back and being like, all right, bring us the offer sheet. Otherwise, they probably have their own offer that they have set out to Precious that maybe isn't the absolute ideal of what he and his agent want to get, but at least, gives them the, gives Precious the opportunity to just sign that deal potentially if he wants to. If I had to guess, I mean, I don't think that Precious ends up costing more than 10 million per season to retain, and that would be just annual value, which would mean average annual value, I should say, which would be the average of what he makes throughout the life of any given contract. So if he got like, for example, and I'm not saying this guy happened, but if he got like a three-year, $30 million contract or something from the Knicks, then that's most likely starting at around like 8.5 million or something like that, and then would come with raises every year, which would then get Precious up to that 10 million average number. But because he's a full bird restricted free agent with the Knicks, that means that they can offer him, I believe, 8% raises year over year. So they could, work something out where they give him a little less as the starting salary, but it would balloon up pretty quickly and get him paid a little more over the following 2 years after that. So I like I said, I think that he's just holding out, seeing if he can find that magical offer that he wants. And I just don't know how many teams there are at this point that would be willing to make that sort of offer. So at this point, you have Utah with over 30 million in space. You have Detroit with over 20 million still in space. Although I think that maybe it wasn't accounting for the fact they just re-signed Fontecchio, so they might actually be down to more like 12 million. And then San Antonio has just under $20 million in space, which, hey, like maybe I wouldn't put it past like Detroit or something to just be like another big, give me that guy. But it is a new regime there, so maybe they're kind of changing their ways a little bit. Um, I don't think San Antonio would go for him. Just it doesn't seem like the cleanest fit next to Wemby. But maybe could be like your four next to Wemby. But they also have Jeremy Sohan, who I think that they're pretty happy with. So who knows? But then you have Charlotte, OKC, and Orlando also looming that all still have their mid-level exception of around $8 million as well. So maybe they would go after him, but I still don't know if I really see it. Like, what's the fit for Charlotte there? What's the upshot? Maybe they just see him as an upside swing and they go for him because they're a team that's trying to be on the rise a bit. So maybe they go for him, but they just gave a bunch of money to Miles Bridges. So I hope that Precious doesn't have to go play with that guy on that team, but whatever. OKC, maybe they're just not done, kicking the Knicks in the nethers just yet this offseason and try to do that again. Orlando, I feel like they're just stacked with bigs. They just gave Jonathan Isaac a new contract and stuff like that. So I don't really think that they would necessarily be looking, but I don't know. Maybe one of those teams does, but they could all pay about $8 million to Precious in starting salary. So I don't know. Maybe that's the deal that they go for. But really, if I had to guess, if I was putting my thinking cap on, like what deal they end up coming up with, I feel like it's probably like 3 for 21, 3 years, $21 million, average out to 7 million a season annual value. I think that's pretty fair. I don't know if Precious has necessarily earned more than that. He had a decent stretch for the Knicks, for a little bit during the season and managed to do some nice things, obviously enough to retain him. But, he also showed some pretty frustrating inconsistencies at different times during the season. So, it's kind of a give and take. But I think that would be a pretty fair amount of money to give him and give him something to hang his hat on as his second NBA contract, but not anything that's, what you would consider an overpay, and not anything that will affect the Knicks' ability to use that taxpayer mid-level exception to still fill out their roster, to maybe still have a little wiggle room at the end of that hard cap, just to make sure, if they have to make a small trade or something during the season that they can. So I think that would be a pretty solid number there. But I want to get into a couple of trade candidates in just a second as well. So one that has been discussed quite a bit from Utah. Another one who's maybe been forgotten a little bit, but whose name has come up from Charlotte. So get to those two guys in just a sec. The show is sponsored by BetterHelp. And let me tell you guys, sometimes I find myself, and maybe you find yourself, comparing your life a little too much to others, right? And does social media play a part in that for you? Like, what do you do when you get caught up wishing your life looked like someone else's? Comparison is the thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives. And it might look like they have it all together on their Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't. And therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. I know I went through this all the time, and still do sometimes. I think everyone does, but especially when I was like in my mid 20s, I felt like I was further behind in my career than I wanted to be, maybe further behind in certain aspects of my life. And I found myself always looking and comparing myself to others and being like, man, I feel like that person is so much further along than me. Like, what's wrong with me? Am I not doing enough? Have I not figured things out? Whatever. And of course, now I find myself in my, early to mid 30s in a much better spot, but probably should have gone to therapy during my mid 20s, and maybe that would have helped me get through some rougher patches. So don't be like me. Maybe give therapy a shot. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba. All right, and I'm back in to keep going through these center candidates. So, a couple names you've probably heard a couple times over the last few days. They've been big on Twitter. Walker Kessler, first guy that I think is a really great potential candidate to bring to the Knicks. Now, I don't know if the price might end up being more than some of the other options, especially some of the guys I'm going to bring up at the end of this episode. But as far as guys that could be like the best fit for the Knicks, I think Kessler is like right at the top of the list. So last year, 8.1 points, 7.5 boards, 2.4 blocks, and zero point 0.5 steals. Shot 65% from the field and played about 23 minutes per game, something like that, which is roughly what he did in his rookie year. Actually put up a very similar season to his rookie year, slightly less efficient. And I think his block numbers were a little lower as well. But it's kind of a weird situation with him in Utah right now. He's on their summer league team, which I think is bizarre for a third-year player who's been pretty good in the league so far. Like a guy who's going into his third year, put together 2 good years to start, was high in like rookie of the year voting last year. Like, I don't know. It's just a little bizarre. It seems borderline disrespectful to make that guy then go to summer league. And I think there's been some reports in the past about maybe he and Will Hardy, the coach, not seeing completely eye to eye, about what his role is going to be or, whatever. I don't know, but things just seem off. So he's going into the third year of his rookie deal, which means he doesn't make a ton of money, which is great. Which means that actually, if you traded, say, Deuce McBride for him, you could do that like straight up, and the Knicks would send out actually, I think, a little more salary in that case because Kessler makes like just under $3 million on his rookie deal this coming season. So that's a plus. Like from the Knicks perspective, it's not a plus maybe to have to send out Deuce. That would be a little heartbreaking, but you have options to potentially fill that spot. I mean, you just drafted Tyler Kolek and just signed him. You still have Rokas Jokubaitis, who might be coming over for summer league, and depending on what happens with Lithuania and international play. So, he might come over for summer league, and then you can get a better look at him, and then potentially sign him if you have to send out Deuce to fill the center hole. Again, I wouldn't love it. I love Deuce, and I think he's been a great success story for the Knicks and their development program. But um, if it ultimately plugs a huge hole of needing another center behind Mitchell Robinson to make sure that you have a contingency and B just like your 48 minutes of rim protection that Tibbs loves so much, then maybe you got to do it. But hopefully you wouldn't have to give up any more than just Deuce if that's what the deal ultimately came to. Hopefully no picks or whatever, but it is Danny Ainge, and he always tries to squeeze the most out of every player that he can if he's trading them. But maybe you could also work a Precious sign and trade as well. I kind of feel like if you could pull it off because of how little Kessler makes, I almost, as much as I say it, think it would make more sense to trade Deuce than Precious and just re-sign Precious and then have your 3 centers there. Because Precious can also slot over to the 4 a little bit if need be. But that way you would for sure like have a solid presence at center all year, especially if Kessler or Mitch or even Precious gets hurt. Hopefully just 2 out of the 3 are always healthy. And that would be really helpful just to have with given how Tibbs values the center position. But either way, maybe a Precious sign and trade is available to make that happen. But I'm not too worried about having to give up too much in the way of assets because like Kessler's value is also clearly depleted. Like if you just look even at some of just the baseline numbers, like just on off and whatever, um, Utah was 6 points per 100 possessions better with him on last year versus off, but they were barely a net positive this year. It was like plus zero point 0.3 with him on the floor versus off. So seems like things have, I don't know, soured in a weird way there. And, his agent would definitely be telling that to teams trying to trade for him. And the Knicks are pretty well plugged in. And, that sort of stuff gets around, I think, in the NBA if certain players are kind of falling out with a certain team or whatever. I don't think that it's like a secret. I think that the Knicks would have a pretty good idea of what it would take to get Kessler. But I'll tell you a couple things that definitely would keep him doing good on this team and fully in Tibbs's favor, I think, and why I think he'd be a perfect guy to hand to Tibbs, to mold like clay. Kessler's been in the 99th percentile in block percentage among bigs his first 2 seasons, which is a very Mitch-like start to his career, I think. And I think in that way, definitely a perfect guy for Tibbs to mold. Also, 12.3% offensive rebound percentage and 23.1% defensive rebound percentage, both really solid, especially that offensive rebound percentage number. So definitely fits the bill for the type of guy that the Knicks like. So and has enough upside, I think, as a younger player that you could reasonably bank on like, okay, well, we won't run into a Hartenstein situation with this guy. Like if we manage to turn him into another Hartenstein, then we'll have restricted free agent rights in 2 years when he comes up, and then we'll definitely be able to keep him. So that's a plus as well, I think. But then you also have Nick Richards, who's come up in regard to the Knicks a couple times, and he makes $5 million this season and next. So that's where things get maybe a little more tricky with trying to make a deal. But you could potentially use Deuce McBride and then maybe find some way to make something work there. Maybe sign and trade uh, Dwayne Washington or something like that, or Daquan Jeffries, someone like that. One of the guys that was on the team last year that the Knicks maybe haven't renounced the rights to yet. Sign and trade them for just slightly more than the minimum, and then that would make the numbers work there, where it's like an even trade, 5 million for 5 million. Though I really wouldn't want to. I'm not gonna lie, Kessler I think has a much higher upside. Like I don't think I would like to include Deuce in a deal for Nick Richards. That seems like a poor use of asset at that point. Like Deuce is on such a value contract, and Nick Richards I think is on a fine contract, and I think he's a fine player, but is not like vastly outperforming his salary or something. So maybe that's where things become a little difficult to get him versus a guy like a Kessler, where it feels like the value is more of a knock out of the park situation. But would he cost a lot? I don't think so. But again, it's difficult to make the math work. I don't think you'd have to give up picks, but what players do you give up? And then are you like put in a position where you have to potentially give up one of your guys you just drafted or something? Like I don't know. That just doesn't seem great. But his averages are pretty solid, like 9.7 points, 8 boards, 1.1 blocks this past season. Shot 69% from the field, so very efficient if limited on offense. And the plus minus or on off numbers not fantastic. Like Charlotte was actually 3.5 points worse per 100 with him on this year, but they were 1.5 better last year. That was according to Clean Glass, I believe I pulled that number from. So that's good, but it's kind of hard to read too much into those sort of numbers on a bad team. But I will tell you what would definitely stick with Tibbs, like 11% offensive rebound percentage and 24.2% defensive rebound percentage. Those will definitely play with Tibbs. So I like Nick Richards. I think there's just sort of logistical difficulties to making a deal for him happen at this point, but it would not surprise me if the Knicks look to go after him because just stylistically, I think he's a pretty good fit. And I think it'd be good. It's just you have to find a way to make those numbers work, and that's sometimes easier said than done. But I think there's a lot of decent non-trade candidates at this point as well that the Knicks could potentially go for. Guys that they could look to just kind of sign on a minimum contract towards the end of the bench. So maybe they just re-sign Precious and then try to sign one other guy on a flyer and try to develop him. And, again, try to find their next like Hartenstein that they can develop up and eventually hopefully retain this time. So I've got like a nice little list of names of guys that are still free agents that kind of stood out to me. So I'll get into those in just a second. But first, I got to let you know about our good friends over at FanDuel. And I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games and the sports aren't sporting like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. And what better thing to do during the summer than bet on the Midsummer Classic. I don't know, something about the MLB All-Star game. Maybe it's just there's stakes involved with it, but I always find it to be the most fun of all the All-Star games. And, you get opportunity to bet on some stuff that, maybe you wouldn't normally be able to and potentially get higher odds because guys are going to be playing for limited amounts of time. But also like the home run derby too. I think that's a fun one. I don't know. It's always one of my favorite events to watch every year. Um, even if my guy Pete Alonso, maybe his prime has passed him by, whatever. So maybe won't be voting on him if he decides to do the Derby this year, but always something fun to do. So, but there's always baseball. There's always tons of great stuff. WNBA, all kinds of things to bet on right now during the summer. So head over to fanduel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the MLB. All right, and I'm back in to get into some non-precious, non-trade candidates that I think the Knicks could go after, potentially to try to help fill that backup center spot. And maybe this is like your third string center. And look, I mean, I guess no disrespect to Jericho Sims. I don't know if I'm there with him. I think I would rather take like some of the guys on this list. I think I'd rather take a shot on than Jericho Sims at this point. I just don't know how much meat there is left on the bone for a guy who's in his mid 20s already that has not made huge strides in his few years in the league, but maybe the Knicks feel differently. But let me just get into some of these names. So Moses Brown has intrigued me for a while. He's played for like a million teams in 5 seasons. I think he played for 3 teams in 1 season the one year. Like he's pushing towards Ish Smith's record of most teams played for at a pretty rapid pace because it seems like he just latches on with like 2 teams per season and just hasn't really managed to stick anywhere, which is kind of weird because like his per 36 numbers go insane. Like he's like a 10 point, 15, 16, 17 rebound double double if you go per 36. It sort of reminds me of like Earl Barron a little bit. Like shout out to that once a Nick, always a Nick, but kind of similar to that where it's just like his per 36 numbers are nuts and you're just like how are you not latching on somewhere? Like how is some tanking team even not just like been like, let's give you like a 2-year deal and see if we can develop you. But he's still only 24. So, maybe Tibbs can kind of, mold him in like Clay, like iHeart or like Mitchell Robinson or, any of the other Precious Achiuwa, basically like any big you put in front of Tibbs seems to play a lot better than you might have expected. So hopefully, maybe that's a guy that the Knicks could look at and give a shot and maybe give a final, spot to stay. Another guy though that I think I'm even more intrigued by, Ibu Baji, who absolutely destroyed the Knicks in one game last year. I was sitting, I had really nice baseline seats that my buddy Matt got that I was lucky enough to come with to go see that game against the Trailblazers, and the Knicks absolutely crushed in that game, which was so much fun. But Baji just wrecked them on the inside, and it was crazy watching him play. I don't know. I think that it really sold me. I mean, to the point where I can remember even when I was doing a mock trade negotiation for Malcolm Brogdon with our buddy Mike Richmond from Lockdown Blazers, that I was like, "What's the deal with Baji, bro? Like, tell me about Baji. Can I get Baji in this deal?" So he's a guy that I would definitely like to look at if I were the Knicks, and still really raw. So more of an end of the bench developmental prospect kind of guy, but I think he's only like 21 years old. Has a lot of growing to do, but has like prototypical size. Clearly has good blocking instincts, really good rebounder. So I think a guy may be worth making the investment in one of those final end of bench spots, or the Knicks should have their 2-way deals to play with still. So maybe that's a guy that they look at with their 2-way deal if they can convince him to come over. Usman Garuba, little undersized, hasn't done enough to stand out thus far in his career. That's why, I mean, he got let go from the Rockets and then found his way to Golden State this year. Didn't really stand out much there either. Um, but I think he has a lot of the traits that Tibbs likes in a big, or at least he did coming into the 2021 draft. His field goal percentage is terrible, though. I mean, he's shooting like in the 30s as a big, which is bad. That's real bad. So you want better out of a big. You want probably at least 50% from a big, if that, if it's a center. So that's not great. But from what I understand, he's been playing pretty well in international play this year so far. I haven't really gotten to watch him, but I saw some people kind of marveling at him the other day. I think Keith Smith maybe was being like, "Oh man, he looks really, really good. Like he's like one of the best players on the floor right now in this international game." So maybe worth looking at. Again, I'm kind of just I look at guys, and if it's someone who's still in their first few years in the league, if you can hand them to Tibbs, I'm kind of looking back at like, okay, what were people saying when they were getting drafted? Like, what was some of the upside there? And is that something that Tibbs could potentially unlock? And Garuba, I feel like maybe there's a chance. Um, then we got Chimizi Metu, who I don't think is maybe the best fit. I don't think he's a great rebounder or a rim protector, but does have decent steal numbers for a big. And I think there's just sort of an outline of a guy that can stretch the floor. So if the Knicks kind of want to go a different direction with one of their bigs, which they don't typically, so I'm not holding my breath on that. But if they want to try to find like a floor stretching big, maybe he's a good candidate for that. But I don't know. Maybe a guy they think about. He played for the Suns last year for a bit. He's played for the Spurs at a different point in his career. I don't know. Maybe a guy worth looking at. Mike Muscala, though, another very different dude that the Knicks could potentially look at. He's a veteran. He's a legitimate floor spacer. He's not a fake shooter. He's like a real shooter, but not a Knicks big in the slightest on defense. So maybe they look at him if they're planning on trotting out a lot of like OG at the quote unquote five. OG is the rim protector with that bench unit. Maybe Muscala makes some sense then. But otherwise, I kind of struggle to see where he would make the most sense. But he's a good vet and an actually good shooter. So if the Knicks want a shooter at the five, like that could be a guy to go with and give you a little different of a look from time to time. And hopefully for just a minimum contract too. I don't think he's going to garner too much more than that at this point in his career. Um, then you got Luka Samanic, who was already on the Knicks at one point, or at least was a two-way deal. And that was earlier on in the Leon Rose era, but maybe he comes back to the Knicks. He absolutely killed it in Westchester when he was with the Knicks, and he got some NBA experience the last couple years with the Jazz. So maybe there's a comeback there. Maybe the Knicks, look back and say, "Hey, we remember what this guy had to offer 2 years ago, and that's why we had him back then." And we're interested in bringing him back on again. So I don't know, maybe, but as far as I could tell, his stats aren't like jumping off the page from Utah. I saw a familiar name, and I'm like, maybe he's worth a shot. But this guy, I probably put him too low on the list. I think he's actually a really good fit potentially for what the Knicks need. Daniel Tice, I think, could potentially give them what they need, and he doesn't seem totally washed yet. He put up 6 points, 4 boards for the Clippers last year. He's a pretty solid floor stretcher from three. I think he shoots like an actually decent, like 36% or so for his career, and has been shooting that recently from three, but also is like a hard nosed rebounder. I mean, certainly the Knicks got enough looks at him when he was with the Celtics. He's kind of a pain in the butt to play against, and is a hard worker and gets out there, just kind of puts his head down, gets rebounds, whatever. Maybe not the craziest rim protector, but he's not like a negative in that regard. So I don't know. I think he could be a perfect candidate to potentially be a. I mean, maybe it takes some of the taxpayer mid level. Maybe there are other teams that kind of bid for his services because I think that he has some pretty strong traits that could help a contender. But I mean, he only played like half the season last year with the Clips, and I didn't really look into the circumstance of that, but I think that he went a decent part of the season unsigned prior to going to them. So I don't think it should be like a crazy competition to try to secure his services, but as like a second or third big, if you have him behind Precious and Mitch, I think that can be good. And maybe he supplants Precious a little bit as a more pure five or whatever, and maybe he's kind of your backup behind Mitch. That also gives you a little bit of a different look with the shooting, but could be cool. And then lastly, I've got JT Thor, who's maybe more of a four. But I remember being intrigued by him going into the drafts. A lot of people were. It's pretty intriguing. He can shoot the three. I think if I remember correctly, he can put it on the floor a little bit too, but definitely seems really raw. He's only 21 years old. Could be kind of a second draft guy to give to Tibbs and see if he can mold him into something better. Rebounding and stock percentages definitely need work. The only thing kind of going for him in his statistical profile at the moment is the 3-point shooting. Looks like it maybe shows a little bit of promise, but even his actual field goal percentage is pretty bad. So definitely a guy you need to kind of work on and work with, but he's got all the athletic tools to make it work. It would just be putting it all together. So maybe that's someone that the Knicks see as a worthwhile investment, but we'll see. I'm sure hopefully we'll be seeing some news soon about who the Knicks are interested in with that remaining 17 million that they can kind of screw around with the taxpayer mid-level with minimum contracts. Obviously, with potentially signing Precious Achiuwa, definitely will need to address that center spot. And whenever they do, we'll be here for you on Locked On Knicks to key you in on that. But until next time, thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Peace out.